With a background in South Asian history and histories of Islam in India, Dr. Green has explored Islam in the company army in India, varieties of studies of Sufism in India, and many works on the Indian Ocean, including his Bombay Islam, the Religious Economy of the West Indian Ocean, 1840 to 1915. And his most recent work is The Love of Strangers, What Six Muslim Students Learned in Jane Austen's London, which was very nicely reviewed in the New York Times and mentioned as an uplifting tale of friendship and reciprocity. Today, Dr. Green will incorporate a range of material in various aspects of Islamic and global history in his presentation titled The Making of Muslim Evangelism, Islam in the Religious Marketplace, from America to Japan.
Well, my thanks to Professor Bose for the introduction, to bring me the invitation and the introduction to bringing me to your beautiful campus and city. I'll be talking today about the Global South, but actually about the movement from the Global South, indeed to the north, of Muslim entrepreneurs based in particular from India. And I'll be addressing two issues today. The first is the larger question, an important question I think in global history and certainly in the spread of global Islam, of how was it, through what processes and forces, and indeed through what strategies, did Islam truly become a global religion in the early 20th century? And I'll be taking the examples then of the United States and Japan as case studies of globalization, in the sense of the Muslim outreach to places to which there was no previous Muslim population, or at least institutional Muslim presence. And the second question I'll be asking then is, why was it that Indian Muslims were disproportionately influential in that global outreach? And I'll be looking at this question then, or these two questions, through a comparative case study of the founding of the first purpose-built mosques in the United States and Japan in the 1920s and early 30s. My aims then more broadly are to try to extrapolate the forces and agents behind Muslim globalization, and indeed between Muslim expansion worldwide. And I'll be showing how Muslim expansion, at least Muslim religious expansion, emerged in the early 20th century as an outcome and a set of responses to earlier 19th century interactions with non-Muslims, and specifically with Christian evangelical missionaries. This is important because, as an early modernist, at least by training myself, what I found when I moved into the study of 19th and 20th century Muslim religious history was that the movements which spread worldwide in the later 19th, early 20th century were not heirs to the early modern forms of Muslim globalization across the old world, not least the orders and other institutions of the Sufi brotherhoods. On the contrary, the new globalizing Muslim religious firms, as I'll call them, of the early 20th century were new kinds of hybrid organizations that were themselves products of exchange. I'll be showing, or trying to show at least, Muslim history then as global history, and thereby as a story of exchange, interaction, and entanglement, and also as a story of competition. And competition is something analytically distinct from conflict. I'll try to talk then in terms of showing religion and religious institutions and forms of religious evangelicalism as dynamic, protean, and productive. Well, the methods that I'm drawing on today come out of a book I published a year or two ago, which in broad argument argued that in the period of imperial globalization, approximately around 1800 to 1950, there was an earlier 19th century phase of Christian evangelical propagation throughout the British Empire that by the mid and late 19th century triggered a series of Muslim responses by which Muslim religious entrepreneurs and firms started to adopt and adapt the techniques and technologies of Christian missionaries. And in doing so, founded a series of counter-missions that were active in that mid to late 19th century phase within Asia itself, India and elsewhere. And what I'll move on today to discuss then in the second part of my talk will be how, in a third phase then, in the early 20th century in particular, Muslim entrepreneurs and firms, religious entrepreneurs and firms, particularly from India, made a larger outreach to the wider world, and indeed to spaces where there had been no institutional Muslim presence before. Europe, the USA, or Northern Europe, the USA, and Japan, as we'll see. Well, I'm drawing here on the methodology of religious economy, a methodology that actually evolved in the sociology rather than economics, but that's what I'll be talking about tomorrow in the seminar. So today I'll stick rather with the materials and the actors and the processes rather than methodology and theory. So, printing was a key element, a key technology in the processes and developments I'll be talking about today. The 19th century then, the period of what I called imperial globalization, was a period of great Muslim religious transformation. This is well known from an earlier historiography of Muslim reform and renewal. But my argument is that a key factor comes out of the transformation in the early 19th century of British religious life in creating a new series of evangelical organisations from the 1790s onwards that were themselves responses to the rapid commercial acquisition of an empire by the East India Company. They were moral responses to the experience of empire, and particularly commercial empire. Evangelical organisations explicitly set out then to shift the character of empire from being mercantile and commercial to being evangelical and Christian and plainly godly. They tried to transform the empire then into an evangelical empire. This was itself building out of a context then in earlier British religious history of liberalism. And I mean liberalism here in the terms of religious economy, and I hope as a value-free term, in which in the terms of religious economy, insofar as the state steps back from regulating religious activity within its domains, so long as the state adopts a policy of non-interference, in these terms then, a policy of religious liberalism, this, in the theory of religious economy, will enable an increasing number of new religious firms and new religious entrepreneurs to act freely or unrestrained, relatively unrestrained, of course never perfectly unrestrained, by the state. And this is, of course, precisely what had happened over the previous century or two of British history, of course, since the Edicts of Tolerance and so on in the later 17th century, and more particularly in the late 18th and early 19th century. This, of course, is in the period between around 1795 and 1815. We have the foundation of the British and Foreign Bible Society, the world's biggest publishing company of any kind at the time and for many decades to come. The Church and Missionary Society, the London Missionary Society, the Baptist Missionary Society. And here's the rub, because, of course, in 1813, with the renewal of the East India Company's charter, the evangelicals in Parliament in England managed to renew the East India Company's charter in a way that would allow for the first time Christian missionaries to enter into the domains of the East India Company, that's to say, into the British Empire in India. But because of the, as it were, religiously liberal nature of those agreements, and indeed of the state and the Parliament from which it was made, that it wasn't only the Church of England, to say the established church, that was allowed then to act within the British Empire, within the Company Empire. On the contrary, one of the earliest new religious firms that moved into colonial India and beyond was the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. Shortly afterwards, the main Germanic missionary society, the Evangelische Missionsgesellschaft zu Basel, based in Switzerland, but actually acting through the German language and various other languages in which it prints. Also, the Société des Missions Étrangères, the main French missionary society, refounded in 1815. So rapidly then, in the East India Company domains, which of course are moving into Burma and what's today Malaysia as well as India, we have this very rapid period after 1813, within literally a few years, new foreign missionary firms, missionary associations, are setting up branches in a whole range of port cities around the Indian Ocean. And what's crucial here is that these are innovative religious firms in a whole range of ways, particularly in terms of technologies of communication. Now we have to bear in mind the starting date we're talking here of 1813 is a period with one major, and actually kind of publishing terms, actually in terms of numbers of books, are rather minor in fact, but with one exception: Muslims are not printing books anywhere in the world. Okay, in 1813. Muslim printing will emerge out of interactions with evangelical vernacular printers in a range of different sites over the following decades. So missionary firms then, this range of Protestant and to a lesser degree Catholic missionary firms, are setting up vernacular printing presses of mass production capacity in a whole range of sites from London to Calcutta into Burma and beyond, and indeed throughout the wider empire and into the Pacific as well. They're also sending out trained polemical preachers who are learning vernacular languages and distributing their texts and persons as well, preachers as well as printed text, through new transportation technologies as the 19th century goes on of steamship and rail. So, one of the new innovations of the missionary firms then is vernacular printing in languages that have never been printed in before. The second innovation then of Christian missionary forms is in their terms of organisation and funding. The notion then of the mission in its later 18th and early 19th century sense rather than its earlier Reformation and Counter-Reformation sense. Missions then were voluntary associations with clear agendas and aims, with lay organisations and committees, with clear charters and effective fundraising techniques and methods of subscription. They're using legal, commercial and industrial techniques to further their very specific agendas, particularly in the case of Protestant missionary firms or missionary organisations, which are dedicated to printing the Bible in as many languages as possible, for our purposes Islamic languages, based upon the Protestant supposition that the Word of God, if people can read it, will it do its own work of conversion. So what happens then through what I've called the catalytic effect of these new missionary firms? They don't actually convert a great many people in Asia, at least within South Asia, and particularly Muslims. But what they do is set up, as I've said, a catalytic effect by which initially their cooperators, particularly their linguistic cooperators, learn to adopt and adapt the communicational techniques of the missionaries, which is to say, vernacular, the use of vernaculars and vernacular printing in particular. What this generates then is, of course, since what we're dealing here with is a period not just of the arrival of missionaries, but of course the expansion of colonial power, this generates a huge Muslim response then, this catalytic effect. One of the most famous religious figures in early 19th century, and indeed in 19th century South Asian Muslim religious history, is Sayyid Ahmad Shahid, who led an unsuccessful jihad against the Sikhs with the intention of attacking the British and the East India Company in turn. But his followers very rapidly, after their military defeat, start to print his works in Calcutta in Persian and Urdu. There are a range then of new Muslim religious entrepreneurs who start to, as I say, adopt and adapt the printing and vernacular printing techniques of the missionaries. Some of the examples can be traced very clearly indeed. One of them is the most important of the early wave of missionaries coming out of the universities, the Oriental, evangelical Orientalists of Oxford and Cambridge, and that figure was Henry Martyn, the great, as it were, romantic hero of the evangelicals, who died as a young man, rather like Shelley abroad, died as a young man, in his case, in eastern Anatolia. Now, Martyn, as we actually kind of saw here, this is actually a picture of Henry Martyn with his munshi, with his secretary, translating scripture in Calcutta and in its environment to the west. Martyn's own helper, his language assistant, Javad ibn Sabat, converts to Christianity as part of his work alongside Martyn, becomes Nathaniel Javad ibn Sabat, but then, a year or two after helping Martyn translate and print the Bible in the New Testament in Persian and in Hindustani, in Urdu, Nathaniel then reverts back to Islam, reverts back to being Javad ibn Sabat, and prints a text out of Calcutta, the same place where he'd learned to print, called the Barahin Sabatir Daradi Aqaid Nusara. That's to say, the proofs of Sabat in refutation of the principles of the Christians, a refutation in particular of the Anglican Christianity being spread by his former teacher and converter. So we can trace at a sort of very specific level this transfer of technology between missionaries and counter-missionaries. Another very important example is with regard to the German missionary Karl Gottlieb Pfander, who worked initially in the Caucasus on the frontiers of the Russian Empire and Iran, but then subsequently moved to British India. His great refutation, originally in Persian, then translated into Urdu and printed throughout India, his refutation of Islam was called Mizan al-Haq, which is to say, the balance of truth. But then that was responded to in India by a figure with whom he was actually in direct debate, a very important Muslim religious figure of the 19th century, Rahmatullah Kadanawi. Rahmatullah Kadanawi adapts the same techniques intellectually as well as technologically, the same techniques of Pfander and other Protestant missionaries of using Germanic techniques of biblical source criticism, which Pfander had applied those techniques to the Quran to show the logical inconsistencies of the Quran. Rahmatullah Kadanawi takes those techniques in turn and turns them back upon the Bible to show the inconsistencies of Christian doctrine, and prints his text in response to Pfander's Mizan al-Haq. He calls his text Azhar al-Haq, not the balance of truth, but the demonstration of truth, which is to say the truth of Islam. So there's the adoption of printing then by a series of Muslim religious entrepreneurs from the early 19th century onwards, and there's also the adoption and adaptation of the organizational form of the mission itself, particularly from the mid-19th century through into the early 20th century and indeed today. When you look at Muslim organizations active around the world today, Muslim evangelical organizations, Muslim renewal organizations, they will typically have one of the following words in their title: Isha'at, Tabligh, Da'wah, or Irshad. In South Asian cases, at least in the 19th century, they would use the term also taken directly from the English Mishan, taken into Urdu. All of these words then mean propagation or teaching of doctrines. Even the most famous figure of Islamic reform tout court, I guess, Rashid Rida, the great Middle Eastern Arab reformer, founded in 1913 his own organization, the Jama'at al-Dawa wal-Irshad, the Society for Propagation and Righteous Teaching. So, what these new Muslim missionary organizations start to do, of course, is precisely to use the same techniques of organization and vernacular printing to spread their counter message then of their own particular forms of very typically reformist rather than customary Sufi Islam. What we're seeing here then in outline is a process of dynamic, generative exchange through the entry of innovative foreign firms, the Christian missionaries, into colonial markets, where they use new industrial techniques of mass vernacular printing. The adaptation of those techniques by local religious entrepreneurs who used the techniques and technologies of foreign religious firms for their own purposes, founding new, in this case Muslim religious firms, and expanding them first through colonial religious domains, religious marketplaces, but ultimately, as we'll see today, through the wider world. Why were Indian Muslims then so particularly active and successful in this global outreach? After all, an organisation like the Tabligh-i-Jama'at is today often claims to be the world's largest religious organisation. It's very difficult, of course, to assess such claims. How did an organisation like Tabligh-i-Jama'at, which of course means propagation society, itself a calque translation of the titles of Christian missionaries, why were Indians so successful? Well, I would say because they were in many ways on the colonial front line of these forms of evangelical imperialism. South Asian Muslims had the deepest, longest, most sustained interaction with Christian missionary organisations from the beginning of the 19th century, from 1830 and onwards. They were the most effective, in turn, at being able to adapt Christian techniques and technologies. Many Indo-Muslim mobile transnational religious firms founded by Muslims then, Muslim evangelical organisations in short, were in addition able to travel freely throughout the networks of the British Empire as a geography of liberal exchange, both commercially and religiously, a geography of free movement then for imperial citizens. It's no surprise then that we have a whole series of these new missionary firms founded in colonial India, one of which we'll see moving to the United States and being foundational in the spread of Islam, not only among other immigrants to the country, but also among African Americans. So let's move then forward to the case of the Ahmadiyya Jama'at, in many ways the most innovative Muslim global religious firm founded in India in the 19th century, and their dispatching of one of their representatives to the city of Detroit and its outskirts. The founding then of the first mosque in Japan. And what we can see here is the famous Highland Park Ford factory in Highland Park, of course, a suburb of Detroit. And it was right opposite there. The position where I took this photograph is literally where the mosque stood, where it was built. It was demolished after a few years. That's another story. But the site where the mosque was built, as you can see, is right next to this magnet of labour migration, bringing Ottoman migrants as well as parts, of course, of other migrants from throughout the United States. So what we'll see now then is how an Indian Muslim religious entrepreneur and the religious firm he represented, the Ahmadiyya Jama'at, the Ahmadiyya organisation, how they could successfully compete in one of the most dynamic urban religious marketplaces of the United States. So the Detroit Mosque then, as I say, the first purpose-built mosque in the United States, was founded in 1921 by Muhammad Karoub, himself an Ottoman, Lebanese migrant to the United States. There were many Ottoman Arabs and Christians working in Detroit in this period. And next to, again, as I say, the Highland Park Ford factory, where the world's first assembly line was, that Ford factory, Karoub, having made his money as a real estate developer, in fact, in the city, selling properties to other migrants like himself, employed an architect called Theodore Degenhardt to build the first mosque in the United States. And we'll see this character of these, as it were, these hybrid, architecturally hybrid mosques being repeated throughout the world, and not least in Japan. Degenhardt, then the architect, was better known for building houses, and it was the 1920s, building movie theatres. And then he's employed to build the first mosque. And the context here in which the mosque is being built, and indeed on the same road, Woodward Avenue, is one with, because of labour migration to Detroit, in not least the period of the great migration of African Americans from the South, a whole sequence of religious firms from the great Christian-dominated religious marketplace of America, the Baptists and every single branch of Baptists and Methodists and Episcopalians, etc., had founded their own rather grand outlets along Woodward Avenue. And it was precisely there, in that, as it were, religious marketplace, that the first mosque was founded. But our real estate developer, Muhammad Karoub, the person who raised the capital for the mosque, himself wasn't a religious teacher. He needed an imam to operate, to teach out of the mosque. And who appeared in Detroit just at that moment, having heard about the establishment of the mosque? It was widely reported, as you can imagine, both in the Muslim international press as well as in the American press, was the religious entrepreneur I'll be focusing upon now from India, Mufti Muhammad Sadiq. Now, he'd been born in Punjab in many ways, the great burned-over district of Indian religious history, where there'd been more and more religious innovation, more and more missionary activity than probably any other area of India. He'd learned Urdu and English and some Arabic through his education in Punjab. He'd worked as a school teacher in Jammu, originally Kashmir, and then he'd joined the Ahmadiyya Jama'at, the Ahmadiyya religious firm, as I've said, founded by the greatest of all Indian Muslim religious entrepreneurs of the 19th century, Mirza Ghulam Ahmad. His entrepreneurial characteristics can be gleaned in the fact that he declared himself not only the Masih, the Messiah that the Christians had expected, but also the last prophet or the new prophet, or indeed the final coming of the Mahdi that Muslims had predicted as well. So in many ways kind of pitching himself into that religious marketplace, the founder of the Ahmadiyya organisation, Mirza Ghulam Ahmad. Our religious entrepreneur in the United States then, Mufti Muhammad Sadiq then, becomes a follower of Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, spends several years working for his newspaper, Badr, the Crescent Moon, In 1915, I'm drawing on here on Mufti Muhammad Sadiq's own autohagiography, as it were, his own autobiography in Urdu. In 1915, Mufti Muhammad Sadiq then sets out on his tabligh-i-kam, that's to say his missionary work in India itself. In 1917, he set off for London, again those imperial transportation networks, and spent several years, 3 years preaching in London. And in 1920, he sailed for Philadelphia, and it was there that he heard about the imminent opening of the first mosque in America, in Detroit, the following year. So, Mufti Muhammad Sadiq moves to Detroit, convinces, there's a photograph of him here in his Urdu autobiography then, the Lataif-i Sadiq. Mufti Muhammad Sadiq convinces the Lebanese founder of the first mosque then, Muhammad Karoub, that he should be the imam. And in this way then, he uses very much a classic technique of the religious entrepreneur, Christian, Muslim or otherwise, of claiming an existing institution. Of course, it's a means of empowerment, it's a platform, it's a means of outreach. He becomes the imam then of the first mosque in the United States. He also then, shortly afterwards, founds a mosque in Chicago, and he actually moves between Detroit and Chicago for a number of years. He also starts making use of other public institutions and platforms, particularly the town halls and workers' halls, of which, of course, there are quite a number in the very blue-collar city of Detroit, to preach and reach out to as wide an audience as possible. His express intention, as he declares in his autobiography, is to convert America, and as many Americans as possible, to Islam. Remember, his organisation is expressly an evangelical organisation. He starts using more broadly the US public sphere to preach, whether in person or in print. The word he uses in the Urdu of his autobiography is challenge karna. Again, we can see the process of adaptation of Christian techniques going on here, even in the language of the text, using the English word then challenge, to issue a challenge. The technique, of course, of Christian missionaries of challenging a Muslim or a Hindu religious teacher to a debate and a refutation of one another's teachings. And that's precisely what he would do, turning the techniques of Christian missionaries in India onto Christians in America. He would travel by train. Again, the same techniques, of course, that are developed across the railroad network of India. Receive invitations from many organisations, many church halls, in fact, by offering to teach and discuss Christianity as well. But, of course, then would show that the truth of the message of Jesus was, of course, the message of Muhammad and indeed of Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, his own master. He founded a magazine, again, drawing upon the techniques that he'd learned as an editor in colonial India with a very developed vernacular press in India by this period. He founded his own magazine, but making use of, again, of the colonial linguistic techniques he'd learned to expand himself into the non-colonial Anglosphere of the United States. So he's printing then a magazine and editing it in English, Muslim Sunrise. As we can see from the image here, that the Shams al-Islam, as it's called there in Arabic script underneath the title, the Sun of Islam, is rising over the United States. And where is it rising from? Highland Park, where the first mosque in the United States is located. So he founds the magazine Muslim Sunrise in 1921. He writes many, many newspaper articles in English for many US newspapers and magazines. Of course, this is the period of the flourishing, of course, of local newspapers and periodicals throughout the US. He prints many booklets, makes usage of the postage system to distribute them throughout the United States and indeed beyond. He founds his own franchise, a local franchise of the Ahmadiyya organization, and uses this local franchise to collect funds. Partly he's deriving funds from the central Ahmadiyya organization within India, but he's also then finding ways to generate money locally for his own branch of the Ahmadiyya Jama'at, the Ahmadiyya organization. He's raising money through tithes. People who convert to Islam then need to pay their zakat, their tithe, their, if you like, their religious tax. They pay their tithes to his organisation. Booklets and journals are sold to followers or indeed to non-followers, and donations and pledges are sourced as well. We know about all this because the Muslim Sunrise is such a fantastic source, because it details to the very last cent, the amount of money is being raised, the costs of these periodicals, magazines, etc., where they're being posted to. You can sign, you can tear out a page at the back, sign your declaration of conversion to Islam, fold it up, stick a stamp on the pre-addressed piece of paper there on the back. It's very effective forms of religious marketing. Mufti Muhammad Sadiq is also a very effective religious entrepreneur as well, a religious salesman, if you like, through these rapid acquisition of local cultural knowledge, of the tastes and preferences, of the nature of local religious demand in the new marketplace in which he's operating. He's particularly effective in getting a sense of African American aspirations and African American political aspirations as well, in, of course, the age of Garveyism. He's also very aware in the 1920s of the spread of popular occultism. Of course, this is the period when the Ouija board becomes, of course, a mass commodity in its own right, a mass board game, and, of course, a mass religious technology. He actually issues in Muslim Sunrise several certificates that show him having completed diplomas in astrology, in occultism, etc. He's doing his best to, as it were, market himself to what he's learning of the religious demands and the character of religious demand in this marketplace. I'm showing here the Muslim Sunrise and Isha'at Islam, then the propagation of Islam, the Urdu version of the Ahmadiyya magazine, to give a sense then of the multilingual and global outreach of the Ahmadiyya organization. In the same period that it's reaching out to the United States, the Ahmadiyya is active in places like China, in West Africa, throughout the world. It's the largest and indeed most innovative Muslim religious firm of its day. The results then, well, naturally, it's competitive terrain, it's a competitive marketplace. Many American Christians and many American Christian pastors, his competitors, start to fight back by writing in response articles about him in the press as well. But nonetheless, he's extremely effective, in many ways much more effective than the Christian missionaries in India had been in converting Muslims. He's much more effective in converting Christians in the United States. Again, we have the names, the addresses, the details, in many cases the photographs of just over 1,000 Americans he manages to convert in the period of the couple of years when he's active in Detroit and Chicago. Who are those people? Well, let's turn first of all to the mosque itself then. One of the outcomes then of these patterns of exchange are the mosque itself and the creation of the mosque from these patterns of migration, Lebanese as well as Indian. But the more interesting, I think, development here, and what I describe in my book, Terrain to Exchange, is the process of generative exchange through religious interaction and competition. The most interesting development, I think, here in the American religious marketplace is not simply the conversion of Christians, as it were, that Mufti Muhammad Sadiq has adopted the techniques of the Christians to indeed convert Christians. The more interesting development, and again, within the logic of religious economy is a dialectic of generative exchange, is the response then of African American religious entrepreneurs who have their own, indeed better, more nuanced sense of the particular religious and cultural needs and demands of fellow African Americans, and they, in turn, adapt and adopt the techniques of Mufti Muhammad Sadiq, the recent migrant from India, to creating a specifically African American Islam. It's no coincidence then that the birthplaces then of institutionalized, let's say, kind of new religious firms for African American Islam then, not the kind of the older lost Islams then of former generations of slaves, but African American Islam as we know it in the 20th century. The key three founders, Noble Drew Ali, Elijah Muhammad and Wallace Fard Muhammad, it's no coincidence then that they are active and indeed founding the Nation of Islam and the Moorish Holy Temple of Science in Chicago in 1923, in the case of Moorish science, and in Detroit in 1923 is the year that Elijah Muhammad moves to Detroit, and indeed that's the very year in which, through Muslim Sunrise, Mufti Muhammad Sadiq makes his great outreach to African Americans saying, convert to Islam, this is the religion of your ancestors, not the Christian religion of your enslavers. It's a few years later then, in 1934, that Elijah Muhammad actually becomes to lead the Nation of Islam, itself having been founded again in Detroit in 1930 by Wallace Fard Muhammad. So many of the converts, initially the African American converts to Islam, converted to Ahmadiyya Islam of Mufti Muhammad Sadiq. But this in turn generated the emergence then of a range of African American religious entrepreneurs, missionaries for their own religious firms that then drew that community into a specifically, as I said, African American Islam. What we're seeing then is through a process of global exchange then, the development of dynamic and productive forms of religious competition that are ultimately generative of new religious entrepreneurs and organizations. Let's move then to Japan. Let's switch the terrain entirely. Let's switch the space of analysis entirely to another region of the globe to which there's a new Muslim outreach that again previously hadn't existed, not least because in the earlier history of Japan through the early modern period, the Tokugawa period, where Japan has its policy of being close to the wider world, there is no, insofar as we're aware, no earlier Muslim presence in Japan before the late 19th century with the Meiji opening of Japan. There might have been the occasional Persian merchant that turned up on Dutch ships in the early 17th century. Japanese Middle Eastern scholars have found evidence of one or two of these figures, but there is no significant and certainly no institutionalized presence of Islam in Japan before circa 1900. So what I'll be looking at now then is the emergence of the first purpose-built mosque in Japan from actually very similar processes of exchange. Well, the background to this then is the Russo-Japanese War in the early 1900s, and as is well known for scholars of Middle Eastern history, the impact that the Japanese defeat of Russia has on Muslims throughout the European empires, whether in the Dutch East Indies, whether in colonial India, whether in the Russian Empire. A number of Muslim religious entrepreneurs then, religious would-be missionaries, set off to Japan with the aim of converting the Japanese, of converting the Mikado, as is called in many Islamic languages, and indeed rumours spread in the early 1900s that the Mikado, the Japanese emperor, has indeed converted to Islam. The most important of these figures in the first decades of the 20th century is a Siberian Tatar called Abdul Rashid Ibrahim, who travels to Japan and subsequently, as a result of his experiences there, prints a text in Istanbul describing his journey to Japan, indeed his methods of intisharat, of trying to spread Islam in Japan. There are a series of other figures as well coming from the Indian subcontinent, and I've written about this at length in a number of articles of the emergence of an Urdu Japanology, or at least an Urdu Japanophilia, and a whole series of Urdu texts trying to get a sense of Japanese society and Japanese life. And it's against that kind of context of Indian Muslim interest in Japan, but more particularly Indian Muslim commercial settlement in Japan, it's out of that context that we have the foundation of the first mosque in Japan. And again, this is particularly interesting because the early 20th century sees a far larger number of Tatar Muslims fleeing the Sovietization of the Russian Empire. These are kind of, as it were, Tsarist loyalists, come and settle in Japan, a number of around 1,000 of them. So there's an earlier, or at least much larger, Tatar Muslim community in Japan. There are also ambassadorial relations with independent Muslim nations, such as Afghanistan and Egypt. And yet, it's Indian Muslims who found the first mosque in Japan. So, how does this come about? Well, the key figure here, our key entrepreneur here, is a merchant, an Indian merchant, in the city of Kobe, one of the two great Japanese ports of the period, Kobe and Yokohama, where Indian merchants, Hindu, Muslim, and indeed Jewish as well, have been settling since the mid-Meiji period, since around the 1870s, 1880s. A religious entrepreneur, in this case, is called Muhammad Abdul Karim Bochia, who worked for a commercial enterprise, an Indian commercial firm called Ahmed Ibrahim Brothers. And it was Bochia then who sets up, after several years of living in Japan, in the year 1929 he establishes the Anjumani Masjid-i Kobe, which is to say the Kobe Mosque Committee. he sets up an organization, a committee, a voluntary association, very much in the form of Christian missionary organizations, with a lay volunteer committee, with methods of raising subscriptions and funds. He founds the Kobe Mosque Committee in 1929 and tries to draw in all of the other senior businessmen, Indian Muslim businessmen of Kobe and Yokohama, to become investors in this new religious firm. In particular, V.H. Turab Ali and Company become one of the most important investors in this new firm. Turab Ali is a really interesting figure because he's actually mentioned in that Ottoman Turkish travelogue that I mentioned a few slides back by Abdul Rashid Ibrahim. He's actually mentioned as wanting to found a mosque even since approximately 1909 when Abdul Rashid met him. But it's actually not him who takes the direct lead, but he becomes one of the key investors then, Turab Ali, in this new committee founded to establish a mosque. And what the Kobe Mosque Committee does then is setting itself up as a form of voluntary association, a kind of one-goal missionary organization to found a mosque, reflects the social as well as commercial business techniques of the gentlemanly capitalism of the businessmen's clubs of Kobe. There were the various English clubs, there were the German clubs, the American clubs, there was even a Canadian club, if I remember correctly. And there's also the Oriental, which then became known as the Indian Club, founded as well. The Indian clubhouse becomes the main place where these Indian gentlemen capitalists are coming to meet and do business. It becomes the place where the meetings for the Kobe Mosque Committee are held. The organisers then of the Mosque Committee use the social solidarity of these fellow Indian Muslim businessmen in Kobe to start to raise funds. In short then, they start to tap their fellow business contacts for contributions. What's important here then, and what I'm showing you here is some of the documents, the primary sources I use that are kept in the Kobe Mosque itself, and the keepers of the Kobe Mosque were very generous in sharing with me their rich archive, which extraordinarily no one seemed to have used before. The organisers then of the Kobe Mosque Committee then made use of the mobility of their merchant network to try to raise funds and investment, not just in Kobe itself, but throughout their own commercial network in Southeast Asia, in Hong Kong, in Burma, in India, and indeed beyond. They sent one of their junior employees, a Mr. Ahmad, who is a very fascinating figure who crops up in one of the other Urdu travelogues of the period as being a Hong Kong-born Muslim of an Indian Muslim father and a Hongkongese Chinese mother who can speak Japanese, Chinese, as well as Urdu and English. And it's him with this kind of set of skills, as well as his day job working for the Sun Life Insurance Company, a salesman in other words. He sets off on this journey around the Indian Ocean to Hong Kong, to Rangoon, to Calcutta, to Singapore, raising money as a kind of missionary salesman for the Kobe Mosque. And again, the wonderful thing about this archive was rather like the Muslim Sunrise magazine. It details every last yen and rupee that was raised in the funds for the mosque. So enough money is raised then, and what do the businessmen of the Kobe Mosque Committee do? They use their commercial techniques for religious purposes. They use their commercial techniques and contacts. They've noticed that a year beforehand, in 1933 by this point, Bohemian Czech architect called Jan Josef Schwager has designed and completed the construction of the Sacred Heart Cathedral of Yokohama. Rather like that we've seen in Detroit, along those the same ways of, as it were, adopting Christian techniques and indeed having a local architect. Here, this Bohemian church architect Jan Josef Schwager is used to design the mosque, and the contractors who actually build it are Takanaka Corporation, the oldest Japanese firm that had been building Western-style buildings in Japan since the late Meiji period. The mosque itself then was founded, and yet its organizational structure, its founding charter, ensured that Indian Muslims would be the dominant figures in running the mosque. Even though at the opening of the mosque there were Egyptian Muslims from the embassy in Tokyo, there were Afghans, there were large numbers of Tatars involved, there were even a few Japanese converts by this point, and certainly speeches were made. We have all of the speeches made at the Kobe Mosque's opening in 1935. There were some Japanese converts as well. Indeed, Bun Shapiro Ahmad Ariga, the first Japanese to translate the Quran, a few years later, that was published in 1938, had converted on the building site of the mosque a few years earlier. So what we have here then, at the mosque itself, when it's founded, as an enduring institution of these interactions, is the ascendancy of Indian Muslims over other non-Indians who were also, of course, Muslims in Japan at this period. And again, to me, as a theorist working within the model of religious economy, what's interesting here is this becomes, again, a generative form of exchange. Just as Indian Muslims who founded their mosque has responded to the expansion of any number of Christian missionary firms into Japan, and particularly into Kobe, in the later 19th, early 20th century, even Baha'i and Theosophical missionaries were active in Kobe and Yokohama. Just as the Muslim missionaries had responded then, as it were, by founding their mosque as the institutional bridgehead for the spread of Islam in Japan, so then that model of religious innovation gets adopted and adapted by other religious entrepreneurs. Not African Americans, as in the case of Detroit, but in this case a similarly down-pressed group of migrants, not African American migrants from the south to Detroit, but Tatar refugees from the crumbling Russian Empire to Japan. Having then been edged out and pushed out of the Kobe Mosque in a few years after its construction, the Tatars then, having learned the techniques of the Indian Muslims, founded their own mosque in Nagoya, the second mosque in Japan in 1936, and their own mosque in Tokyo, the third mosque in Japan in 1938. They tried to copy the techniques of the Indian Muslims in raising capital through commercial firms, but they weren't a wealthy community of businessmen. So what did they do? Is they tried to draw on, indeed as they did successfully, particularly for the Tokyo Mosque, of drawing on the Zaibutsu, the Japanese great corporations, to invest in the mosque. But yet what's interesting again is when those Tatars founded their first mosque then, the Nagoya Mosque of 1936, who did they invite to lay the founding stone and to open the mosque and to preach the first sermon there? But a gentleman called Muhammad Abdul Alim Siddiqui, an Indian Muslim who a few years earlier had founded the All-Malay Muslim Missionary Society. So again, we're seeing the unexpectedly large role of Indian Muslim religious entrepreneurs even in these Tatar mosques. So, to come to my conclusions then, my two questions that I'd ask. How was it that Islam spread to be a truly global religion in the first decades of the 20th century? Well, my argument has been that this came through not the continuation of the old medieval and early modern forms of expansion through the Sufi brotherhoods and their own networks, indeed through the Sufi shrines that had attracted so many converts and new Muslims across the old world of Eurasia. Rather, the spread of Islam through mosques in particular came through the adoptive and competitive response of Muslim religious entrepreneurs to 19th century evangelical imperialism. It came through the adoption by new Muslim religious firms, new Muslim evangelical organizations, the adoption of the organizational techniques, the communicational techniques, the transportational techniques of their Christian evangelical rivals. And what this ultimately created was an entirely new geography of Islam. New sacred spaces, or at least new spaces of mosques, that were not in the older, largely inland geography of Islam in Eurasia in previous centuries, but in new capitalist global transportation hubs, in new port and business cities such as Kobe, such as Detroit, or indeed new centres such as Woking, the first purpose-built mosque in the United Kingdom, or in Berlin, where here too Indian Muslims, whether in Britain or less expectedly in Germany, were the key figures in founding the first purpose-built mosques. And again, what's interesting about these mosques is that these were mosques that were not continuations of older, early modern, or as it were, pre-imperial, pre-colonial forms of mosque architecture. These were new hybridized Orientalist mosques, in a sense, typically built by non-Muslim architects employed by Muslim religious firms. So, my second question, why was it that Indian Muslims were disproportionately influential in this global outreach, even into spaces, as it were, non-British imperial geographies, such as Japan or the United States or indeed Germany? Well, I've argued that it was through their use and access to imperial travel and business networks that gave them the edge of mobility worldwide. It was through their advanced English skills that allowed them to expand not only to Britain but also to the wider imperial and American Anglosphere. Their competitive edge in terms of communications, both linguistically in terms of language skills, but also in terms of their skills in printing, newspaper editing, journal founding, etc. And finally, I think over the longer period of colonial history, because Indian Muslims had, ironically, the comparative advantage of being early adapters of printing, organizational, missionary skills from having been the longest exposed to the evangelical imperial onslaught of British and indeed American and German missionaries from the early 19th century. What I hope I've shown then is, as the outcomes of globalization, of mobility, of interaction, these larger processes of dynamic and generative competition and exchange. Thank you for listening.
Well, thank you so much for a very rich and informative talk. We have a few minutes for questions, and I'm going to indulge the fact that I have introduced you by asking the first question, just as quickly as I can. One element that sticks out to me is that a big part of this world is just before the First World War, and then also just after. And you didn't mention as such the effect of the First World War or the Khilafat movement or pan-Islamic movements, and I'm curious if you could comment a bit on whether or not this is an alternative world, or if this is at all linked to those other, perhaps more well-known facets of Muslim history and globalization.
Right, yeah. Well, yeah, you're absolutely right that the First World War has had no role in the telling of this story or these processes at all. I think that's largely because, working as I like to do from my primary materials, from my sources, whether in Urdu or whatever it is, or the Kobe Mosque documents, it simply had no presence for these particular religious entrepreneurs, at least as they told their story and set up their own businesses and organizations. Of course, for the Indian Muslims in Japan, the First World War, the Second World War was a great disaster because they had their assets seized. The mosque itself survived, as you could see, the only building that survived, in fact, the Allied bombing of Kobe. But the Indian Muslims in the Second World War had their assets seized as British imperial citizens. So the Second World War was tremendously important. But the First World War, and indeed the economic collapse after the First World War, the Indian Muslims in Japan there actually were flourishing for various reasons, of actually riding out the Great Depression and riding above it through the commercial rise of Japan. In the European case, again, I think with the particular religious firms I'm looking at, I don't think the First World War had a tremendous impact, strangely enough. I think, of course, with some of the better-known religious organizations of the 1910s, absolutely right, the Khilafat movement, it's absolutely, completely central. But strangely enough and oddly enough, I think in my story it's not really there as a presence because I didn't find it reflected in the sources itself. The one exception to that is, I think, with the case of the founding of the first mosques in the founding of the first mosque in Germany, and also the founding, in fact, of the first, or at least the Paris mosque, the first purpose-built mosque within France as well, that these were much more outcomes of the presence within Europe of large numbers of Muslim soldiers then working for the colonial armies. The Algerians and Moroccans who fought for the French in the case of the Paris mosque, and Indian prisoners of war in the case of not the Berlin mosque, but the previous mosque in a POW camp. Before that, as I understand it, wasn't, as it were, a mosque in this kind of the same architectural sense. Mm-hmm. But I think that's important there within the model of religious economy. I think that does actually constitute those forms of migration through military labour migration did actually create a substantial demand for religious institutions. Interesting enough, in the French case, it was the state that responded. And I think what's interesting in bringing in the First World War there, as I'm thinking about in the French case, is it actually kind of demonstrates to us that in different political setups, different types of religious economy, the state can be a major player, or the state not be a major player. So in the kind of, let's say, the British and American context of the state not being a player in the religious marketplace, that's actually, it's perhaps not surprising that it's non-state founders who established these early mosques. But in the French case, of course, where there's a much longer tradition of French governmental intervention in religious life, in the religious life of its citizens, and I think that really reflects, as in the case of Russia and the state founding of the first mosque, for example, in St. Petersburg, the state role in that is actually, again, kind of reflects the different nature of different religious economies and the relationship of the state to religious activity within its domains.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there are lots of different questions here. Why don't we start, follow the hands, why don't we start with Bikram and then we'll move onward. So Bikram, please.
Thanks for the talk, and so much there. I think we're going to have a rich discussion tomorrow in the seminar. I suppose, I can really see how your work really contributes to what we're doing with Global South Colloquium and to global history, in the sense that, often there's an account that colonialism happens, or European expansion happens, and other people receive it and are passive in this, and I like how you're really contributing this notion of adaptation and response and agency in that way. With that said, however, there does seem to be some implications of the way in which, it seems to me there's a premise of, say, separating, you're saying, that early kind of the Sufi period from the later modern colonial period, and even the way in which you kind of quickly mentioned the African American experience, how the question of slavery and the retention of Islamic history there, it didn't really bear upon it. And the reason why I think that might be significant is have you thought about how then you would risk reproducing a diffusionist history? The religious economy starts with a European experience, right, with European technologies and expansion of Europe. And then this is an adoption, adaptation of this. So there's an origins diffusion kind of thing happening from there to Indian Muslims to African Americans, but the point of origins is quite clear. And then when you think, on the other hand, the early liberal thinkers like John Locke, the way they were informed by Ottoman understandings of religious pluralism, so there was clearly a trafficking the other way too, right? Even that original space of the religious economy was informed by Ottoman Islam. And as one example, and then this thinking about the really rich conversation between Muslims and Hindus in India several centuries ago, does that not bear in upon? Is it a clean break? Is there a need for us to keep in mind these traces from elsewhere to break out of that origin diffusion thing? And in thinking about, I guess, African American Islam in particular, I wonder about, I'm not just familiar with, it was really fascinating to hear about that. Immediately when you talked about Ahmadiyya, my mind went to Nation Islam, so I was interested to see how it did go there. But is there anything in the African American experience beyond being a diffusionary kind of reception that is more, I guess, generative in some sense, right?
Okay, great. That's a very rich set of questions, actually. I'll do my best, because it may not be very good to respond to them. I mean, generally, that deserves a whole conversation in its own right. So, I mean, I think one of the issues that I try to bring up in the book really is in starting with at least the first chapter with the evangelical imperialism, what I call the Parnassus of the evangelical empire, the universities of Oxford and Cambridge. Where, of course, the main institutional sites of the generation of this Orientalism, evangelical Orientalism, as a discourse of imperial power. Of course, the problem with that is it does indeed seem to set up the missionaries as the prime movers in this story of global exchange. But of course, one has to start an analysis somewhere, but I'm fully aware that, of course, and it's absolutely clear that the missionaries themselves, the very foundation of their organizations from the 1790s onwards, is itself a response to the empire and indeed to the presence of Muslims in the empire. So it's a question of, kind of chicken before the egg of where does one begin it. So you're absolutely right, these developments can be traced back much earlier. But having said that, of course, it is rather like when one looks at, the adaptation by Muslims of communication technologies of their, let's say, their cultural competitors when I'm thinking of Islamic State using the iPhone. the fact of the matter is that that is invented in California and it's used by ISIS, for example, another set of religious entrepreneurs, just in the same way as the printing press does spread from Europe to the Islamic world, and that's simply a diffusionist fact, So there is that there. With regard to what you said, I think with regard to you're absolutely right about the presence of many other Islams, whether African Americans or indeed within the Indian subcontinent, or indeed the spread of Sufi missionaries who come from India and elsewhere, but India in particular, to Britain, the United States, France, in exactly this period, and who indeed are the other Muslim competitors of the figures I look at. What I'm interested in is not trying to sort of write out that history. I mean, I wrote a book about that within the context of the religious economy of the Indian Ocean, where Sufis were relatively more successful. But my point is, with regard to looking at mosques, is that I'm not looking at religion per se. I'm looking at the foundation, the institutional presence of Islam and sites and organizations for the generation of social power through religion. And I think in that way, Sufi organizations, individual Sufis, let's say the older oral legacy, insofar as it ever survived, you don't really know of the folk memories of African American Muslims over the generations, that simply could not compete with the very effective techniques of the social generation of power through institutionalized religion, through mosque foundation, whether with this first mosque or the diffusion of other mosques, of course, and dominant religious firms from many other places within Asia, was much harder to compete. So it's not so much, I'm not trying to sort of silence out those other pluralistic forms of Islam, but to say that actually within competitive religious marketplaces through to the present day, we need to see techniques of competition within Islam as well as between Muslim and Christian religious entrepreneurs, and see how institutionalization and organization, those are the kind of key skills that allow some types of Islamic doctrine, Islamic organization to flourish where others fall by the wayside.
Yes, Hani.
Yes, thanks very much for the lovely information we received tonight. But when you talk about Islam, spreading of Islam in different points in the world, apart from mentioning Sufism and Ahmadiyya, which are considered by many Muslims as really non-Islamic doctrines, what kind of Islam are you talking about? Are you making a general, description of Islam as such? Islam is so many Islams, as we know. So, what kind of Islam was, leading this, and is it right to call it Islam per se?
Right. I mean, you're absolutely right that there is, of course, a great variety of Islams in the world. We know that. In fact, in this way, the model of religious economy is very effective in that way, because one of my bigger arguments in fact, the main argument I try to make overall within the study of Islam in the book Terrains of Exchange is that, in fact, the model of religious economy shows that competition, religious competition, not least between Muslim religious entrepreneurs and firms themselves, needs to have differentiation of their particular brand of Islam. It needs to have, if you like, kind of product differentiation. So what I argue through the book there is, in fact, what happens through globalization and through global exchange, interaction, generative exchange through competition, is not the spreading of a homogenized Islam, not the spreading of a global Islam. Quite the contrary. Competition between different Muslim religious organizations and entrepreneurs will, on the contrary, generate generative exchange, competitive generative exchange, will create an increasingly fragmented religious landscape throughout the world. So actually the force of religious economy, the model of religious economy, actually shows us how and why religious pluralization or alternative fragmentation takes place. But in talking about, about why I'm calling it Islam in this more vague and general way, is actually because all Muslim religious firms, whether they're Shiite or Ahmadiyya or Barevi or Deobandi or Wahhabi or Salafi, all of them say this is Islam. This is the true Islam. So, that in a sense is actually, kind of the language of my sources themselves, and indeed the kind of the branding of what they're trying to do with their products. What actually happens, of course, with the Ahmadiyya in America is because they're actually, the earliest and most effective religious firm to be there, they said this is Islam. It's only later on that actually, when there are more competitors there, that people actually start to find out, no. In other parts of the world, people don't consider this Ghulam Ahmad a normative Muslim. Try this version instead, etc. So, yeah, but you raised, kind of very thought-provoking questions. Thank you.
Okay.
We have limited time, but I want to make sure we all get our questions out. Yes.
Well, thank you. It's been absolutely fascinating hearing this very textured narrative. It reminds me of subaltern studies in the sense you're coming from the ground up. But building on this last question, because we seem to have sort of bracketed out the history of Muslim modernism or revivalism, because the ideological competition inside the Indian Islamic scene at that time, whether you're looking at the Salafi, the whole Aligarh movement, or even the Sufis, especially the Bhakti movement, how did that interplay with what actually these people were messaging? I mean, in the sense that even though you're saying that they're claiming this Islam, how were they negotiating this ideological competition within? What face did that take?
Right, yeah, that's a very interesting question, because again, it takes me to one of the things I haven't talked about, which is the semantics of exchange. As I say, kind of not just what I talked about today, largely the organisation, the communicative, let's say the external social apparatus of exchange and competition, the missionary organisation, vernacular printing, etc., but what's actually happening within doctrine itself and message. And I think in that way, we can actually see that there is very much too, at the level of doctrine, whether the adoption of occultism, which I touched on, the creation of occult Islams, the creation of one of the chapters in the book I talk about is the spread of kind of Freemasonic forms of Islam within Hyderabad, of adopting Freemasonry, of course, all the prestige that had in empire, to, if you like, Freemasonic Islams, the creation of, by a notable Hyderabadi Hindu, of a Hindu Sufism, as it were, that aligned with the political preferences of the Hyderabadi elite of creating something more composite, suggesting that agency is more important than identity. You can be a Hindu and create a new Islam, and if you've got the agency and the organisation to do that, that's more important than just being, as it were, born a Muslim. So I think, and indeed, with what you've talked about with reformists, of course, many of the reformist elite of Indian Muslims in the later 19th, early 20th century, of course, were in turn responding to, and of course this has been worked on, as I'm sure you know, by various scholars really from the kind of 1970s onwards, were the way in which that, as it were, the Ashraf class of English-educated 19th century Muslims from Sayyid onwards were trying to respond to the earlier attack on Islam as being, let's say, kind of anti-feminist, or whatever the terms were of the day, pro-slavery, etc., by creating, if you like, liberal reformed Islams that were themselves in dialogue and competition. So what I would say, those liberal Islams were, it's not to say that in other circumstances there might not have been other liberal or emancipatory forms of Islam, no doubt that's equally possible, but in those specific colonial circumstances, the emergence of these other forms of, let's say, the liberal Islams that I've talked about, were very much that part of exchange and competition and the creation of newly hybridized Islams. Again, what I've talked about, the increasing fragmentation, the more exchange there is, that process is generative and is indeed a dialectic that creates something new and something new and something new.
And of course, the rise of Orientalist scholarship, I think at the same time, Royal Asiatic Society influencing, and especially how quickly, as you put it, printing started taking place. So, I mean, that whole sort of construction of knowledge from these various sources.
No, that's right, absolutely. And for me, as a historian that actually really came out of anthropology, and I see myself as kind of an anthropologist manqué, is really that texts are nothing in the social world unless they're communicated, unless they're read, and how many readers they have, publication, distribution, vernacularization, what language, this is really important. So you're absolutely right that through printing, there's a massive speeding up of the exchange of ideas and the competition between ideas. And of course what we see now through the internet and so on, and through handheld publishing with your iPhone, is of course, kind of the ongoing, technologization of these new, what were much more rapid in the 19th century processes of competition and communicative exchange. That's happening even more quickly now, when you don't need a printing press, you just need an iPhone.
Dart?
Thank you very much. This is a really fascinating talk, and the material is just great. I guess I have two questions. One is empirical, and the other is more conceptual or methodological. And the first is, you talked about, was it Sadiq who set up the mosque across from the GM, or the Ford factory?
Yeah, he becomes the imam. He didn't found it, was Mohammed Karoub, the Lebanese. But yeah, he becomes the effective guy who runs it, yeah.
Right. So this is the moment at which, Henry Ford is actively trying to suppress unionization of his plants. The Russian Revolution is lurking either in the foreground or the background. I'm curious what these guys working in their mosque across, given these critiques of liberal capitalism that are evident at the time, what did they actually think about capitalism? Do you have any data on whether they had a critique or whether they were fine with it or whatnot? The second question is methodological, and has to do with this argument or this analogy that you make between the way economies work and the way religions work, and the kind of way in which economy or religion flows as a kind of object within the medium of the market. And I wonder if there's any difference in terms of reckoning profits in terms of capital compared to reckoning it in terms of souls. In other words, is it fair to call these people religious entrepreneurs in the same sense that, you know, Henry Ford is an entrepreneur, or that, are they enmeshed in liberal capitalism in exactly the same way? And I guess that this kind of clicked for me when you mentioned, you know, these guys are using these commercial techniques that they've learned through their trade and through their business life for religious purposes. But it strikes me that these commercial techniques, if you look at them in the longue durée of history, aren't commercial. I mean, if we take Weber seriously, they're actually religious, right? So, I mean, these guys are in some sense embodying what Weber identifies as the Protestant ethic that turns into the spirit of capitalism. So I wonder, I guess, whether that translation works, and whether, if Weber's right, these guys aren't actually Muslim after all. They're just Protestants going around proselytizing and guided by the spirit of capitalism that has its roots in the Protestant ethic. So, I don't know. Explain that to me.
So the easy bit, as it were, with the first question is what did Mufti Muhammad Sadiq or others at the mosque opposite the Highland Park factory think of capitalism? I don't know. There are no sources on that. I can perhaps glean in a way that from Mufti Muhammad Sadiq's magazine that there's an evident embrace of commercialism. I think of the commercial opportunities of American life and indeed investment of buying his products, which he indeed sells. But beyond those inferences, I don't know. With regard to Weber though, I think here I hope I have a better answer, because it's something I've thought about a great deal. Now, I think it's fair to, and I think it's analytically important, particularly within the study of Islam, to think about religious firms as particularly religious entrepreneurs, because figures like Mufti Muhammad Sadiq or many other Muslim figures themselves would never claim that they're innovating. And this is why I think the language of religious economy and the creation of a standardized set of categories to describe different characters is really important, because in Islam in the study of Islam, we have a very, very weak analytical vocabulary. And the main reason for that, I think, is that largely Islamists, for a range of reasons, have been quite happy to adopt the emic vocabulary of not only Muslims, in fact of reformist Muslims with whom Orientalists since the 19th century were in very close dialogue. So I think the importance of religious economy gives us an analytical vocabulary that is ethic. And it's particularly ethic with regard to external, let's say, with regard to the entrepreneur as innovator. Because, of course, as we all know, as many of us know, that the word innovation, be that within Islam, is what all Muslims, at least would-be Muslim leaders, would say, I'm not innovating at all. This is not bid'ah. This is true to the message of the Prophet. So by, actually, as it were, having emic vocabulary, having vocabularies that don't actually recognise innovation, thereby change, thereby history, thereby process, we can't actually write a religious history of Islam that isn't, in fact, has no history, has no change, has no movement. And I think religious entrepreneurs thereby, that's a useful vocabulary, and indeed they do change and they innovate and they do many things. So they are entrepreneurs, in a very Schumpeterian sense, I'm happy to go that far. But they're not capitalists. So that's the difference. Their purpose isn't to be capitalist, to accumulate capital They might want to accumulate, as it were, institutions, but their purpose, I think, conscious or otherwise, what religion does in the world, what religious organisations do, is generate and accumulate social power. Social power in the sense of Michael Mann as, as it were, the basic energy of the human world. The way to persuade other people to act in this way, act in accordance with your will or the will you've inherited from others according to a tradition. So I think that's the difference. They're entrepreneurs, but they're not necessarily capitalists. With regard to Weber, though, I think these figures look like Protestants because they're largely operating in a marketplace where they're competing with Protestants, and they're adapting and starting to look like more like Protestants in order to outcompete them. They're adapting Protestant Christian forms to create Protestant Muslim forms that have appeal in a Protestant American marketplace in America, or a marketplace in Japan where Protestant missionary firms, Christian Protestants, have been much more successful. But the difference is, I think, with religious economy is that it has no teleology, as with Weberian sociology, but it has no teleology towards Protestantization. Now, in my book on Bombay, and indeed in Terrains of Exchange, I show that actually with religious economy, according to the nature of what I call rates of exchange, of the interplay of supply and demand, of innovation, of custom, of the tools, of what's available, of the nature of preferences and innovation, the interplay of supply and demand then within any religious marketplace, that might create a Protestant type of Islam or religiosity in the United States in the same period when, as I showed in my Bombay book, in the Indian Ocean, because of the nature of religious preferences, tastes, custom, in the very same period, in the most modernized, Weberian-looking cities of the Indian Ocean, places like Bombay or Durban, we actually get the flourishing of a highly charismatic and very, not Zauberhung, but kind of more Zauberhung, as it were, kind of more enchantment again. So I think that's the added value, I think, of religious economy, that it has no teleology that actually can show at the same place, that indeed you can have re-enchantment actually following disenchantment and so on. There is no end point. Thank you.
It seems to me that these mosques, from what I understood from what you said, were mostly set up to serve commercial class Muslims living in foreign lands. So with that, how successful were they in their evangelical movement to draw in local citizens to them? And what's happened in the sense? Either is there a vibrant Muslim community in Japan, which is still a very insular country? And in North America, in Detroit, for example, I think most of the mosques are again serving Muslims who've come from other lands and their offspring, as opposed to evangelical. And that's the impression it gets, and I could be completely wrong on that. But I'm wondering how much a lot of talk has been on evangelicals and the copy of it. How successful was that?
Right, okay. So I'll answer that in two ways. One by kind of staying in period, and one by, let's say, kind of moving through the 20th and 21st century. So the case of Japan and the United States and those first mosques are very interesting comparisons, because we actually can look, as indeed you asked me to, at the relative success rate of conversion and evangelicalization. With regard to Mufti Muhammad Sadiq then, within a couple of years of his presence, he claims to have converted something like, if I remember correctly, the names all given over the issues of Muslim Sunrise, around 1,200 people. That's really quite significant, and as I said, rather like the Christian missionaries, his larger effect is an effect that isn't direct, but is actually a knock-on effect of this generative exchange that's showing, as it were, other religious entrepreneurs, African Americans, how to create something bigger and institutionally similar, etc., etc. So I think there's a very significant kind of impact with Mufti Muhammad Sadiq and his mosque within that time period. The differences with Japan, and I think this is again why it's interesting actually kind of looking at the limits of evangelical reach in these techniques, is that Indian Muslim entrepreneurs, and indeed Muslims more generally with their Japanophilia, never managed to develop a Japanology, which is to say they're never able to really kind of develop the same kind of communicational skills in Japan as they are through the Anglosphere, particularly Indian Muslims. So whereas Mufti Muhammad Sadiq is able to found his Muslim Sunrise, write letters to pretty much every newspaper throughout the Midwest, etc., no one's able to do that in Japan. They're only able to actually get one or two Japanese converts who will translate the Quran, etc., and have a much more watered down effect. So, again, this is actually kind of when we actually look at the specifics of techniques and their limits, linguistic techniques in this sense, we can actually see why one institution, one missionary institution is more successful than the other. Looking for the second part of your question, if I can move to the second half of the 20th century, I think one of the important things about religious economy and its focus on specifically religious firms and entrepreneurs is it breaks down this idea that all these people are Muslims, all these people are Islam. It says, okay, when we're looking to measure or assess religious life, we need to look at the organisation, the actual, let's say, the mosque or the organisation, the community organisation, whatever it is, that people are following. And in that way, we actually see competition much more within Islam and conversion, so to speak, movement from one type of religiosity, one religious firm, one entrepreneur, one imam, one leader to another, much more within brand than without it. So it might look that, let's say, religious entrepreneurs aren't succeeding because in Detroit today, kind of around Michigan, most of the Muslims are, ancestral Muslims. They've been Muslim before they're Muslim now. And indeed throughout, let's say, Britain, the majority of Muslims in Britain or France are, ancestral Muslims. But a religious economy approach would say that's not enough. We need to actually see the actual patterns of internal competition by which Muslims have switched from one brand or one religious firm and switched their faith commitments, their material investments, their investments of social power, of following, of time, of money, whatever it is, actually within brand. And in that way, actually, we can have, I think, sort of much more of an analysis of seeing a great deal of religious activity and change that's hidden when we just, let's say, kind of talk within not the language of religious economy and sociological specifics of firms and entrepreneurs, but within, as it were, the broader emic language of we're all Muslims. And in fact, sociologically and concretely, that actually hides all of the diversity, competition, and fragmentation that is in fact going on within inter-Muslim evangelical competition.
I found it really interesting, just as an aside, in the Kobe Mosque, the notes you had up were in English.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
so was that because that was a common language for the various...
That was the common language for those upper-class Muslims. There were some materials there in the mosque materials in Urdu. There were Urdu materials written about Japan, but those gentlemen capitalists, those kind of upper-class Indian Muslim businessmen, that was their common language, and indeed the language of their entire enterprise. So again, that was the linguistic limits. Let's say the evangelical orientalists of the Christian missionary firms, who had the advantage of, let's say, kind of a much longer, much wealthier Orientalist associations, were able much earlier to print the New Testament into Japanese, to print missionary materials in Japanese. So the Christians, of course, as we know today, there's a very strong legacy from that period, from the late Meiji period, of Japanese Christians. Japanese Christians of various denominations, largely Protestant, in fact. And of course, that is precisely because, if I could have had much longer time, I already took enough time as it was, but actually to look more comparatively about, kind of the missionary competition within Japan of these new religious firms, Christian, Baha'i. Actually, really, the Baha'is are an interesting case because the Baha'is in Japan, the Baha'i missionaries are in fact American. American converts to Baha'ism, not Iranians, went to Japan and were able to preach not through English, but through Esperanto. And the Esperanto movement was very big among kind of early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century Japanese intellectuals. So they went through all the Esperanto societies and said, you've got a global language, here's the new global faith of Bahaism. So again, the competition is sometimes between, within brand, within Islam, and sometimes, kind of without brand, but communication is always absolutely essential in the social world, of course.
Well, tragically, we'll have to stop. We'll well over time here, but...